Julius Caesar wasn't born a god, but he lived like he was destined to become one. From his earliest days in Rome, ambition burned in his chest like a fire that couldn't be put out. The city was chaotic, filled with corrupt senators, violent gangs, and endless rivalries. But young Caesar looked at the mess and saw opportunity. He carried a name, yes, but not wealth. His family claimed descent from Venus, the goddess of love, yet their fortune had withered. Caesar knew he needed more than noble blood. He needed power. As a teenager, Caesar learned early that survival in Rome meant balancing loyalty and betrayal. The dictator Sulla had seized control, ordering executions of anyone linked to his enemies. Caesar's marriage to Cornelia tied him to the wrong faction, and suddenly his life was on the line. He refused to divorce her, even when threatened with death. That act of defiance nearly cost him everything. But it also revealed his stubborn core. He would not bend. Caesar slipped out of Rome, hunted, stripped of safety, but unbroken. He was already learning the lesson that would define him. Play the king, but never surrender your hand. Exile hardened him. Without the comforts of Roman luxury, Caesar wandered from place to place, joining the military, earning scars, and building his reputation. In Asia Minor, he proved himself more than just another patrician boy. He showed daring in battle, leading men with a charisma that caught commanders' eyes. Soldiers respected him because he shared their struggles. He slept on the ground, marched beside them, and took risks. In a world of aloof nobles, Caesar felt human, and that made him magnetic. Men would follow him not out of fear, but because they believed in him. Yet Caesar's charisma was paired with calculation. He wrote carefully, documented his deeds, and shaped his own legend. Even in his 20s, he understood the power of narrative. Battles weren't just fought on fields. They were fought in memory. If people remembered him as brave, daring, and loyal, he could climb higher. Already, he was scripting his destiny, blending truth and embellishment into something larger than life. It wasn't enough to be good. He had to be unforgettable. That was Caesar's secret weapon, turning every scar into a story worth repeating. Adventure followed him like a shadow. On a voyage across the Aegean Sea, Caesar was captured by pirates. Most men would have begged or paid ransom. Caesar laughed. He joked with his captors, demanded better treatment, and even promised he would one day return to kill them. They thought it was bravado, a spoiled aristocrat's bluff. But when ransom was paid and he was freed, Caesar raised a fleet, hunted them down, and nailed them to crosses. The story spread across Rome. Here was a man who didn't fear humiliation, a man who turned even captivity into a stage for greatness. By the time he returned to Rome, Caesar was no longer just a name in dusty records. He had become a figure people whispered about, a man who had already bent fate once or twice. His enemies saw arrogance, his allies saw brilliance. Caesar himself saw destiny. Every step had confirmed it. He was meant to stand above the crowd, yet for all his daring, he still played the Roman game carefully. He knew power in Rome wasn't seized overnight. It was built brick by brick, alliance by alliance, with patience and blood. And Caesar was ready to build. Rome itself was changing. The Republic was decaying, torn between corrupt senators who clung to wealth and ambitious generals who commanded private armies. Violence spilled into the streets, and laws bent under the weight of bribes. The people grew restless, desperate for leaders who would fight for them instead of themselves. Into this chaos, Caesar returned, armed with charm, scars, and stories. He wasn't yet the Caesar of legends, but he was becoming dangerous. Rome didn't know it yet, but its future ruler had already begun sharpening his sword. Caesar entered politics with the same charisma that had carried him through battle. He spoke with passion, his voice rising above the noise of the forum. He promised the poor what no senator dared to offer: attention, bread, land. Dignitized words dripped with hope. The people cheered, while the elite sneered. They called him reckless, dangerous, a populist, willing to destroy tradition. Caesar didn't care. He was building his base, brick by brick, and he knew the Senex scorn only made him more beloved by the month. The man who played God was learning how to play the crowd, but charm wasn't enough. Caesar mastered Rome's social networks, the marriages, debts, and alliances that tied the republic together. He knew who to flatter, who to borrow from, and when to betray. He climbed the ladder, office by office, each step carefully staged. Some whispered that he was too bold, too fast, but Caesar understood momentum. Power wasn't something you waited for, it was something you seized. He didn't rise by accident. Every handshake, every speech, every calculated risk was part of a larger script. He wasn't just playing politics, he was playing destiny. By the end of his early career, Caesar had proven himself resilient, charismatic, and cunning. He had faced death, humiliation, and exile. He had emerged stronger each time. To the people of Rome, he was becoming more than a politician. He was a savior in the making. Totus Inapte was a threat wrapped in a smile, and to himself, he was already something greater. A man chosen by fate, ready to bend the republic to his will. Caesar had survived his trials, but his greatest gamble was yet to come. The stage was set for history's most dangerous game. Caesar understood that Roman politics wasn't about rules. It was about survival. To survive, he needed patrons who could shield him from enemies while fueling his rise. That's where Crassus, the richest man in Rome, stepped in. Crassus saw something dangerous in Caesar, not just ambition, but charisma. Money could buy silence, armies, and loyalty, but only charisma could ignite the crowd. Together they formed a bond of convenience. Crassus provided the gold, Caesar the fire. It was a deal born not from friendship but from necessity, and both men knew it. Yet to Rome's elite, this was already a warning sign. A young man with the people behind him and the wealthiest man at his side could shake the republic's balance to its core. But Caesar knew money wasn't enough. Rome was a city drunk on glory, and without victories, no politician could rise. Wars were the republic's currency, and Caesar was desperate to mint his own. He looked at Gaul not as a borderland, but as a theater where his destiny could play out. Rome expected stability. Caesar dreamed of conquest. His rivals wanted him out of the city to keep him irrelevant. Instead, they handed him the stage of a lifetime. Every battle would be more than survival, it would be theater, propaganda, and proof that Julius Caesar was no ordinary commander. He wasn't just chasing victories, he was chasing immortality. Marriage became another weapon in his arsenal. When Caesar offered his daughter Julia to Pompey, the Republic's most celebrated general, it wasn't just about family, it was chess. By tying himself to Pompey's household, he bound Rome's most powerful general to his ambitions. The people saw it as unity. The Senate saw it as manipulation, but Caesar saw it as insurance. His alliance with Pompey and Crassus was an official law, but it became known as the First Triumvirate, a triangle of power Rome couldn't ignore. Caesar played the role of mediator, but deep down he knew he was laying the groundwork to dominate them both. The triumvirate was more than an agreement. It was a quiet revolution. Rome's republic, once proud of its checks and balances, was now a puppet in the hands of three men. Each brought something different. Crassus had wealth, Pompey had military prestige, and Caesar had the people. To the Senati, this was terrifying. To the people, it was intoxicating. Caesar wasn't yet Rome's master, but he was learning how to bend the republic without breaking it. Every decree, every alliance, every bribe was another brick in the foundation of his rising empire. He was no longer just playing the game, he was changing it. When Caesar secured command in Gaul, many senators thought they had rid themselves of him. To them, Gaul was a distant, wild land, more punishment than privilege. But Caesar saw the opposite. Gaul was the canvas on which he could paint his masterpiece. Here, he could fight endless tribes, claim endless victories, and feed Rome a constant diet of glory. The Senate thought they had exiled him to obscurity. Instead, they had handed him the perfect stage. For Caesar, Gaul wasn't a problem to manage, it was an empire to seize, and he intended to squeeze every drop of fame from it. On saying Gaul, Caesar revealed his brilliance. He built bridges in days where others predicted months. He marched armies across rivers and mountains that seemed impassable. He struck tribes before they could unite, always staying a step ahead. His enemies saw a man of reckless speed, His soldiers saw a commander who shared their hardships. He slept in the mud, endured the cold, and bled with them. This was no aloof aristocrat. This was a general they would follow into hell. And every time he won, he didn't just secure a land, he secured loyalty, both in his legions and in the hearts of Rome. But Caesar's true genius lay in his pen. He documented the Gallic Wars with precision, sending dispatches back to Rome that made him a household name. These reports weren't dry military racconti, were stories, crafted to make him the hero of every chapter. He turned minor skirmishes into epic battles and made victories sound inevitable. Even defeats were framed as struggles against impossible odds, proving his and the people ate it up. And suddenly, Caesar wasn't just a commander. Abroad he was a legend back home. His enemies seethed, but they couldn't silence the roar of the crowd. The Gallic Wars became both sword and stage. Every campaign brought him more wealth, more fame, and more soldiers loyal to him. Not the Senate. He paraded prisoners through Rome, displayed strange treasures, and reminded citizens that their empire grew because of him. Rome had always admired conquerors, and Caesar knew how to turn admiration into worship. Each victory chipped away at the Republic's fragile foundations. He wasn't just expanding borders. He was expanding his myth, and once a man's myth grows larger than the state itself, the state becomes his plaything. Still, ambition breeds cracks. Pompey, once proud to stand beside him, began to feel overshadowed. Crassus, hungry for his own glory, itched for conquest. The alliance that had made Caesar untouchable began to unravel. Rome was not built to contain three egos of such size. It demanded a clash. Caesar, ever the gambler, saw the storm forming. Yet he didn't flinch. He knew that when alliances broke, only one man could rise above the ruins, and he intended to make sure it would be him. The stage was shifting, but Caesar was ready to take the lead role. By the height of his Gallic campaigns, Caesar had become more than a politician, more than a general. It was a symbol of Rome's expansion and pride. He had more wealth than the Senate, more soldiers than Pompey, and more loyalty from the people than anyone alive. He was dangerous but also undeniable. Caesar no longer pretended to follow the Republic's fragile traditions. He was rewriting them with every step, bending the state to his will. The man who once played the role of God in whispers was now beginning to believe it himself. Caesar's campaigns in Gaul were unlike anything Rome had seen. He didn't just defeat enemies, he annihilated them with speed and precision, leaving tribes scattered before they could form coalitions. The Helvetia tried to migrate across Roman territory, and Caesar used the excuse to unleash his legions, crushing them in a brutal demonstration of power. To Rome, it was framed as protecting allies. To Caesar, it was his opening act. He wanted the people of Rome to see him not just as a governor handling barbarians, but as the man expanding the empire's frontiers. Every victory sent shockwaves back home, proof that Caesar's star was rising higher than anyone had imagined. As the years passed, Caesar's war in Gaul turned into something far bigger than expected. He wasn't just putting down tribes, he was carving out an empire. Each campaign brought him more gold, more captives, and more fame. The legions under him became fanatically loyal, not to Rome, but to Caesar himself. He rewarded them with spoils, honored their bravery, and made them believe they were building history together. The Senate grew uneasy. They had sent Caesar to Gaul to keep him busy, but instead, he was building an unstoppable war machine. By the time they realized their mistake, it was already too late. The Battle of the Sabis against the Nervi showed Caesar at both his weakest and strongest. Ambushed by a ferocious enemy, his legions were nearly overwhelmed. For a moment, it seemed Rome's pride would be shattered in a foreign forest. But Caesar, refusing to retreat, rallied his men personally. He charged into the chaos, inspiring his soldiers to fight harder. Against all odds, the Nervi were crushed. Back in Rome, Caesar's reports transformed a near disaster into a heroic tale of courage. His legend grew because he never admitted weakness. Every scar became proof of destiny, every danger a stepping stone to greatness. But Caesar's conquest wasn't only about battles. He built infrastructure roads, bridges, and forts that stitched Gaul into the Roman system. He wasn't just conquering land, he was reshaping it into something Rome could control. This foresight made his victories lasting, even centuries later. Roman influence remained across regions he subdued. Caesar knew that war was only the first act. Permanence came from integration, by turning conquered tribes into Roman subjects. He wasn't just a general, he was acting like a king or, perhaps even something greater. A man shaping civilizations like a god with clay in his hands. His enemies called him ruthless. And they weren't wrong. When tribes resisted, Caesar responded with overwhelming force, massacring thousands, selling survivors into slavery, and burning villages. These actions horrified some in Rome. But Caesar spun the narrative brilliantly. He claimed every act was necessary to protect Rome's safety. The people believed him because his victories made them feel stronger. In truth, he was using violence as theater, crafting an image of invincibility. To his supporters, Caesar was Rome's guardian. To his enemies, he was a force of nature. Either way, he was becoming too powerful to ignore. One of Caesar's most dramatic achievements was the crossing of the Rhine. No Roman army had ever dared to march into the Germanic lands across that massive river, but Caesar wanted to send a message. Nowhere was beyond his reach. He ordered his legions to build a wooden bridge across the Rhine in just 10 days, a feat of engineering brilliance. Then, he marched his army across, terrified the Germanic tribes, and withdrew before facing a major battle. It wasn't about conquest, it was about intimidation. He showed Rome and the world that he could bend even nature itself to his will. Then came Britain, Tuthe Romans. It was a misty island at the edge of the known world, more myth than reality. Caesar, never satisfied with the ordinary, decided to invade. Twice, he launched expeditions across the English Channel, facing fierce resistance and unpredictable weather. The campaigns were limited in success, but in Rome, they were celebrated as groundbreaking. Caesar had gone where no Roman general had dared, turning myth into reality. He hadn't conquered Britain, but he had conquered imagination. His soldiers followed him into fog and fear, proving they believed in his vision of pushing Rome's boundaries further than ever before. Bikin, Rome. Sharpened their knives. Senators whispered about his ambition, claiming he sought kingship. Pompey, once his ally and now his uneasy rival, watched with growing suspicion. Caesar's fame eclipsed even Pompey's great victories in the East, and jealousy began to fester. The triumvirate that had once seemed unshakable was cracking apart. Crassus died in a failed campaign in the East, leaving Caesar and Pompey as inevitable opponents. The balance was gone. Rome could not hold two giants at once. A storm was coming, and Caesar knew it. He just had to decide when to strike. Caesar wasn't reckless. He understood that timing was everything. He carefully delayed his return to Rome, staying in Gaul as long as possible to build more victories, more wealth, and more loyalty. Every year he remained abroad was another year the Senate grew restless. They demanded he disband his legions and return as a private citizen. Caesar knew what that meant: arrest, humiliation, possibly death. He would not step down. He had built too much, climbed too high, to surrender now. Rome demanded obedience. Caesar demanded destiny. Something had to give, and Caesar had already chosen his path. By the end of his Gallic campaigns, Caesar was more than a politician or general. He was a phenomenon. He had crossed rivers, oceans, and borders no Roman had dared. He had reshaped provinces, crushed enemies, and rewritten Rome's sense of possibility. His soldiers adored him, his people worshipped him, and his rivals feared him. Caesar was no longer just a man. He was an institution, larger than Rome's fragile republic itself. And in that moment, as he looked back on his conquests, he must have felt what he had long suspected. He wasn't simply playing God anymore. He was becoming one. Caesar's victories in Gaul dazzled the crowds but terrified the Senate. Each dispatch home-read like a coronation hymn, and senators heard in it the end of their relevance. With Crassus dead, the fragile geometry of the triumvirate collapsed, leaving two suns in the Roman sky. Pompey basked in old glory. Caesar radiated new fire. Whispers multiplied in marble corridors. He commands too many legions, owes too many favors, loves the people more than the law. Yet the law had withered into habit, and habit could not restrain a phenomenon. Rome needed harmony, it received suspense. Caesar, measuring the mood like a general studies terrain, understood the moment. Retreat meant trials, engineered by enemies. Delay meant forfeiting momentum. He had survived Sulla, pirates, and the snows of the Alps. He would not be undone by paperwork and envy. The city itself felt the split long before swords were drawn. Bakers, bargemen, and barbers repeated street versions of Senate speeches, and the forum buzzed like a beehive disturbed. To the urban poor, Caesar was the first patrician in years who spoke in promises they could taste. Grain measured, debt seized, veterans settled, two equestrians and creditors. He was lucrative motion, two stubborn aristocrats. He was a tide, threatening, ancestromer. Pompey kept the keys of tradition temples, titles, tribunals, but Caesar held the pulse. Loyalty was turning from statute to sentiment. Rome had always balanced factions. Now the scales themselves seemed to tilt, as if history had chosen a side and was waiting for the men to admit it. The private drift between Caesar and Pompey hardened into public geometry. Their alliance had been practical, not devotional. And practicality expires when fame becomes a zero-sum game. Pompey, once the golden measure of generalship, saw his parades dim beside Caesar's relentless reports. He cultivated senatorial trust, presided in the city, and told himself he was saving the republic from a storm. Yet storms grow because coasts are proud. In Pompey's councils lived a paradox. He feared monarchy, but cherished eminence. He guarded the law, but leaned on decrees. Caesar read his old partner shrewdly honorable, capable, but increasingly stationary. Civil conflict is often a race between motion and fear. Caesar would move. Pompey would marshal. The republic would hold its breath. The ultimatum arrived dressed as custom. Disband your legions. Return as a private citizen. Trust the courts you have embarrassed. Caesar counted the likely verdict: charges, confiscations, exile, perhaps a dagger mislabeled as justice. He probos, mutual disarmament. A facave in symmetry the Senate rejected. To them, compromise felt like capitulation. To him, their demand felt like erasure. Ambition can be vulgar. Self-reservation is universal. He framed his resistance not as conquest, but as protection of dignitas, of soldiers who had bled, of treaties signed in mud and paid in scars. Legality without fairness is choreography. Caesar would not dance to a tune conducted by rivals composing both melody and noose. His legions needed no speeches to choose. Years in the north had fused commander and cohort into something closer than contract. He shared rations, praised by name, punished with restraint, and paid on time. He staged difficulty as destiny, turning bridges into theater, night marches into folklore, and narrow escapes into proof that the gods favored audacity. Veterans carried his credibility like a second shield. Younger recruits inhaled it and stood taller. They were Romans, yes, but also Caesarianza, new civic category built from gratitude and grindstone. When rumors of the Senate's decree reached the camps, indignation outran orders. Loyalty, once a line in a ledger, had become a living bond. If Rome wanted their general humiliated, Rome could come collect him. On a winter night at the Rubicon, the future shrank to a river's width. Torches hissed, horses steamed, boots waited for a word. Geography sometimes impersonates destiny, and this shallow ribbon of water auditioned for the role. Caesar paced the bank, hearing, perhaps, the arguments of caution as clearly as the hoof stomp of opportunity. Beyond lay treason, war, and the arithmetic of loss. Behind lay lawsuits written by enemies, honor pried loose from its hinge, and the silence unworthy of a story. He chose the grammar of action. The die is cast. He said whether in Greek or in Latin, hardly mattered. He crossed, the men followed. Time followed them both. Rome's reaction was not resistance, but evacuation. Panic travels faster than couriers. And by morning, the city's confidence had packed its archives and fled with Pompey toward safer musters. Caesar advanced without sack or swagger, a conqueror performing restoration, not rupture. He secured granaries, soothed crowds, and treated the capital like a patient, not a prize. Optics matter. He let mercy be rumor and order be spectacle. The message was simple. I come not to dismantle Rome, but to rescue it from those who hoard its language and squander its people. In politics, tone is a weapon. His sounded like home. Money oils campaigns, and the treasury at locks, but Caesar had keys, made of necessity. Opened mace coffers, and framed it as guardianship. Coin safeguarded from flight, pay guaranteed for legions, stability purchased against the inflation of fear. Critics named it theft, supporters called it stewardship with a sword at its belt. He avoided cruelty's theater, preferring paperwork and paydays to purges. Letters flew to municipalities, promises flew faster. If law is a map, he drew detours. If legitimacy is a chorus, he taught new harmonies. The city breathed again, not tranquil, but rhythmically. Confidence is half of victory, and he was already banking it. Pompey did not collapse. Eastward he gathered legions, fleets, and the respective provinces more loyal to precedent than to personality. He was still formidable, still the man who had cleared the seas and humbled kings. The Senate declared him Rome's lawful sword, and many honest men believed it. Caesar understood the battlefield that widened beyond walls. It ran through the grain routes, the island harbors, the treasuries of allies, the tempers of undecided towns. This was not a duel, but a season. He would have to be swift where Pompey was strong, generous where Pompey was cautious, inevitable where Pompey was correct. For Caesar, the crossing had converted suspicion into strategy. He narrated himself as reluctant savior, compelled by envy's plot to defend the Commonwealth from its custodians. That story half steel, half silk fit. The moment, soldiers needed purpose beyond a pay. Citizens needed dignity beyond bread. He offered both, wrapped in the confidence of someone who had rehearsed history until it answered on cue. The Republic had asked whether a single man could bend it without breaking it. Caesar's reply marched on roads he had built in Gaul and walked on faith he had built in men. The Civil War had begun not as thunder, but as a decision. The opening moves of civil war unfolded like a grand chessboard, where each piece carried memory and fear. Caesar, moving swiftly, aimed to secure Italy before Pompey could anchor deeper alliances. His speed was his ally. Hesitation was his enemy. Villages and towns, sensing the drift of history, opened gates rather than face sieges. He promised clemency, and clemency became currency. Where Sulla had terrified, Caesar reassured. Soldiers witnessed the contrast and mirrored it in discipline. A war that could have begun with fires and famine began instead with momentum and myth. The optics of restraint were as valuable as the tactics of advance. Pompey retreated strategically, but retreat speaks in two voices. Two senators who fled with him. It sounded like prudence. Two ordinary Romans. It echoed as abandonment. Caesar knew perception could be weaponized, and each empty seat in the forum whispered his opponent's absence, louder than speeches ever could. He cultivated the appearance of reluctant power, a general forced into politics by the irresponsibility of rivals. That narrative caught fire because it felt less like propaganda and more like common sense. People do not remember who followed the rules. They remember who stayed present when fear swept the streets. Spain became Caesar's next target, for legions loyal to Pompey still camped there. He marched with astonishing speed, his columns covering distances that stunned allies and exhausted enemies. Logistics became legend. Bridges raised overnight, rivers crossed with borrowed boats, rations stretched without rebellion. The campaign was not just about geography, it was about psychology. Each rapid success announced to Pompey supporters that resistance meant exhaustion, not triumph. Caesar knew memento was a currency even richer than coin. He spent it generously, and it repaid itself with interest. By the time battles were joined, half the victory had already been won in the imagination. The Senate branded Caesar an outlaw, but outlawry is fragile when the outlaw commands loyalty. Decrees written in Rome mattered less than oaths spoken in camps. His soldiers had endured cold winters and bled on foreign soil under his command. Now they saw the Republic's aristocrats denounce him from safe villas. The contrast hardened loyalty into conviction. Caesar played the role of protector, not predator. He spoke of defending Rome's dignity, not erasing it. He reminded them that his enemies called the people fickle and the army dangerous, while he called them citizens and comrades. Legitimacy often belongs to whoever names the moment. Meanwhile, Pompey gathered his strength in Greece, courting kings and mustering fleets. The East had resources Rome depended on: grain, gold, and men. Pompey held the seas, and with them the arteries of empire. Caesar faced a paradox. He owned the heart but risked starvation without the stomach. Naval inferiority stalked him like a shadow, yet he thrived in constraints, turning limitations into laboratories. He pushed for shipbuilding, cajoled allies, and prepared to gamble on speed again. Pompey looked invincible at distance. Caesar specialized in collapsing distances until invincibility looked like illusion. The stage for decisive conflict was set not in Rome, but across the waves. Cleopatra and Egypt flickered on the horizon of his plans, though their full entanglement waited for another act. For now, Caesar calculated in more immediate terms: supplies, morale, timing. These were his gods. He wrote letters filled with reason but marched with the logic of storms. To the Senate appeared reckless. To his men, he appeared inevitable. That contrast was itself a weapon, reshaping expectations. A general who refuses to stall redefines what normal looks like. Caesar knew hesitation kills revolutions before swords touch. By always moving, he ensured that the Republic itself struggled to catch its breath, much less oppose him effectively. The Roman public lived in suspense. Their city turned into a theater of rumor. Forum debates replayed in taverns, graffiti accused and defended in the same stroke. Mothers wondered if their sons would return. Creditors wondered if their debts would vanish. War is not only fought by armies, it leaks into kitchens, markets, and prayers. Caesar understood this, weaving his mercy campaigns as much for Rome's imagination as for military necessity. Each spared town became a headline. Each negotiated surrender became an advertisement. He was not just winning territory, he was winning narrative real estate. In the Roman mind, Spain surrendered, not with a cataclysm, but with exhaustion. Caesar treated defeated legions with clemency, and clemency turned into recruitment. Soldiers prefer service to starvation, and many who once wore Pompey's oath now carried Caesar's standard. This was no longer a civil war of ideologies, it was a war of gravity. Men and towns gravitated toward whoever moved faster, promised more and punished less. Caesar became not just a commander, but a center of orbit. His enemies were still strong, but their circle shrank. The Republic, in practice if not yet in name, was reorganizing itself around one man's momentum. By Rame, his absence did not erode influence. Proxies carried his message, allies held positions, and enemies lacked the confidence to seize control. Caesar had mastered a paradox. He governed more effectively by marching than by sitting. Presence radiated from victories, not from benches. The Senate, once the hut of Roman authority, now looked more like an audience reacting to his campaigns. Each success redefined politics as commentary on Caesar. Opposition became less about principle and more about survival. That transformation was subtle, but seismic. The Republic was already bending. Even before the decisive blows had fallen, Pompey, though still formidable, faced the slow corrosion of morale. Allies feared being the next amino. Legions wondered if loyalty meant hunger. His reputation as Rome's great defender remained, but reputations crack under siege. Caesar, by contrast, converted every march into theater, every gamble into myth. He was rewriting the grammar of power, turning civil war into a story where he played not villain or rebel, but architect of destiny. Whether Rome agreed or not, the script was being staged. The question was no longer whether Caesar would challenge the Republic, but how the Republic would survive the challenge. The crossing into Greece was less an act of strategy and more an act of audacity. Caesar, short on ships, packed his men tightly and sailed. Despite Pompey's naval dominance, fortune, or perhaps sheer nerve, allowed him to slip past blockades. It was a gamble that could have doomed his cause, but gambles had become a signature. Soldiers trusted him not because he never risked, but because risks with him often transformed into triumphs. The sea whispered danger, yet the shore answered with survival. In those moments, destiny felt less like prophecy and more like stubbornness. Pompey was waiting with numbers that dwarfed Caesar's. His forces, fed and rested, looked invincible, but size is not always strength. A large army strains its own supply lines. Discipline thins as numbers swell. Caesar knew this and kept his smaller force tight, like a blade honed sharp. Where Pompey looked imposing, Caesar looked efficient. The contrast mattered. One resembled empire, the other inevitability. Two men on both sides. Perception felt heavier than statistics. War was as much about what soldiers believed as what generals planned. Caesar excelled at making belief feel like fact. The standoff stretched, tension eating at both camps. Winter winds petard, knowing at morale. Caesar's men, veterans of Gaul, endured with a grim pride. Pompey's coalition, pulled from varied provinces, cracked under cultural seams. Language, loyalty, and local grievances rubbed raw, ensured tense. Caesar leaned into unity, reminding his men they fought not just against Pompey, but against Rome's decay. He cast their struggle as cleansing, not rebellion. Framing mattered. It transformed suffering into purpose. In war, hunger becomes tolerable when called sacrifice, while comfort becomes corruption when framed as cowardice. Skirmishes flared, small battles, but tested nerves more than tactics. Caesar used them to sharpen his soldiers' confidence, showing that even outnumbered, they could sting Pompey's pride. Pompey, cautious, avoided decisive engagement. His allies called this patience. Caesar painted it as weakness. Each avoided battle whispered louder than any victory. Soldiers grow restless when glory is withheld, and restlessness breeds doubt. Pompey's strategy of delay meant to starve Caesar, risk starving his own men of belief. Caesar turned every hesitation into an unspoken campaign poster. Follow me, and at least you'll fight. When the decisive clash at Pharsalus finally erupted, it was not just armies that collided, it was narratives. Pompey's legions stretched wide. Designed to encircle, Caesar countered with depth, stacking loyalty against quantity. Dust rose like prophecy. Screams cut through like punctuation. Caesar rode where lines wavered, his presence a living shield. He did not just command, he embodied steadiness. Pompey, distant, seemed more strategist than soldier. In the theater of war, proximity plays like faith. Soldiers fight harder when they see their general bleed dust with them. Caesar understood this better than any textbook of tactics. The battle tilted faster than maps predicted. Caesar's veterans, disciplined by years of brutal campaigns, broke through Pompey's cavalry and folded his lines inward. Panic spread like infection. Order dissolved. Pompey, once Rome's champion, fled not with thunder but with silence. Defeat rarely announces itself loudly. It whispers shame into ears and knees buckle before orders are even given. Caesar had gambled against smaller numbers, tighter lines, unrelenting confidence, and won. Pharsalus was not just a battle. It was the hinge of the Republic. From hits deuced, one man began to look less like general and more like destiny. Pompey fled to Egypt, seeking refuge among monarchs he once supported. But refuge is fickle when power shifts. Pharaoh's calculations are cold. For them, sheltering a defeated general meant provoking a victorious Caesar. The choice was cruelly simple. Betrayal masked as diplomacy. Pompey, once so commanding, met his end, not in glory, but in betrayal. His death removed an enemy, but also denied Caesar the theater of mercy. It was a reminder that control in war extends only so far. Fate always reserves the right to write a darker line. When Caesar arrived in Egypt, he encountered politics as treacherous as any battlefield. Cleopatra, ambitious and brilliant, saw opportunity in alliance. The Nile became less a river and more a stage where survival and seduction performed together. Caesar, wary yet calculating, found himself pulled into dynastic struggles that felt both distraction and destiny. Aligning with Cleopatra gave him resources and spectacle, but it also fed rumors back in Rome. Politics, like war, thrives on whispers. For Caesar, e.g., became both refuge and complication, a reminder that power never travels light. Back in Rome, news of Phasaelos and Pompey's fall spread like fire. Relief mixed with dread. Some celebrated an end to chaos, others feared a beginning of monarchy. Caesar cultivated the image of reluctant victor, stressing mercy and reconciliation. He invited exiles back, pardoned rivals, and framed his ascent as necessity, not ambition. Yet mercy, while disarming, also unsettled. People wondered if it came from magnanimity or calculation. Forgiveness, when given by someone unstoppable, feels like both blessing and warning. Caesar knew this tension and leaned into it, shaping his image as more than a conqueror. For the Republic, the Civil War's outcome was seismic. Institutions looked intact, but their spirit wavered. Senators debated, but under the shadow of Caesar's presence, laws passed, but with his nod already embedded in their phrasing. The illusion of continuity masked the reality of change. Rome remained Rome in marble and ritual, but in practice, it was bending around one man's orbit. Caesar had not declared kingship, but monarchy had begun to feel less like treason and more like gravity. The question was no longer whether he could rule, but how long the Republic would pretend he did not. Caesar's victories reshaped Rome's political map, but the city he returned to was not the one he had left. The Senate, once proud, now bowed in cautious respect. Citizens, weary of endless conflict, greeted him as both savior and threat. His parades showcased not just spoils of war, but also the symbolism of inevitabilityrum. No longer had rivals, either abroad or within, yet in every cheer lurked unease. Was Caesar the cure for chaos, or simply the architect of a new kind of control? The Republic's walls still stood, but their foundations trembled under his shadow. He presented himself as a reformer, not a tyrant. Grain distribution, debt relief, and colonization for veterans became his talking points. To the common people, these policies looked like compassion. To the elite, they looked like consolidation. Reforms were written in ink, but read as power plays. Every new law solved the problem, while weaving another thread into Caesar's net of influence. He was careful, almost theatrical, in balancing generosity with dominance. Rome was not merely rooted, was curated, and Caesar, the curator, knew exactly how to design admiration that disguised dependency. His calendar reform, introducing the Julian calendar, seemed mundane but carried immense weight. Time itself was recalibrated by his decree. When a man resets how the world marks its days, he edges closer to divinity. Ordinary Romans saw it as clarity. Elites saw it as audacity. Days, months, and years, aligned not by tradition, but by Caesar's authority. It was practical, yes, but also symbolic. If Caesar could bend time, what could not bend beneath him? His genius was not just in commanding armies, but in embedding himself into daily life. Subtle, yet inescapable. Yet, whispers of kingship began to spread. Rome hated kings. Its very identity was born from rejecting monarchy. Caesar, keenly aware, avoided the crown in public. The symbols betrayed him. Statues, honors, and titles piled up. Friends called him father of the country. Poets painted him in near-divine strokes. Each gesture, though small, built an image of royalty without the word itself. His enemies sharpened accusation. King, in all but name. Caesar laughed it off, but he also let it linger. The paradox became his tool. He denied monarchy while practicing it daily. Festivals became theaters of loyalty. When Antony offered him a crown during the Lupercalia, Caesar pushed it away, knowing the crowd watched more than the object itself. Refusal won applause, but the attempt left scars. Some saw humility, others saw rehearsal. Was the rejection genuine or staged? The ambiguity was Caesar's genius. Let people argue over meaning while he kept control. In politics, confusion can be more powerful than clarity. By turning symbols into puzzles, Caesar forced Rome to debate his ambition, while he quietly shaped its reality. Despite his dominance, Caesar projected clemency. Enemies who expected execution found pardon instead. Senators returned to their seats, Rivals regained estates. To the world, it looked like mercy. To Rome, it felt unsettling. Mercy from a man who held all the cards reminded everyone how fragile their survival was. They lived at his discretion, not the laws. Forgiveness became a demonstration of power, not restraint. By sparing lives, Caesar proved he could end them at will. Clemency, intended to soften, often hardened the sense that Rome's fate now rested in one man's hands. Behind the mercy, resentment brewed. Senators who owed their safety to Caesar chafed under the weight of gratitude. Gratitude feels like chains when it comes from a superior. Each act of pardon reminded them of their own failure, their own submission. Caesar might forgive, but they could not forget. Rome's elite thrived on pride, and pride resents being spared more than being defeated. The Republic's traditions, once their armor, now felt like costumes in Caesar's theater. They bowed, but inside, their knives itched. Clemency had bought peace, but it also planted betrayal. Meanwhile, Caesar's vision stretched beyond Rome. He spoke of campaigns eastward, of crushing Parthia, of avenging Croesus's defeat. Expansion had always been Rome's rhythm, and Caesar played it louder. His soldiers longed for new horizons, and he longed for new glory. Yet ambition abroad unsettled his enemies at home. They feared a returning Caesar crowned, not just with laurels but with kingship undeniable. Each proposed expedition sounded less like conquest and more like coronation. Rome's walls whispered, uneasy. If Caesar conquered the world, what title would be left but king? Amid grandeur, Caesar's personal habits became political. Lavish banquets, rumored affairs, and his liaison with Cleopatra fed gossip. To the people it was theater, to his enemies it was ammunition. Cleopatra in particular symbolized both allure and alarm. Was she his ally, his lover, or his queen? Her presence in Rome unsettled tradition, stoking fears of foreign influence. Caesar brushed off the whispers, but they stuck. In politics, perception is reality. Each rumor, true or false, added color to the portrait of Caesar not as Roman champion, but as a man above Roman restraint. Even his triumphs, parades of prisoners and treasures, cut-bought wilds. Crowds cheered, dazzled by gold and spectacle, but senators watched grimly, seeing not celebration but consolidation. Every cheer from the people widened the gulf between Caesar and the Senate. The Republic thrived on balance, but Caesar tilted the scales with every parade, every reform, every pardon. By the time senators realized the scale had tipped too far, it was no longer about saving Rome. It was about survival of tradition, of pride, of their own lives, and survival often whispers. One word: conspiracy. Caesar's aura stretched beyond politics. It began to flirt with divinity. Statues showed him crowned with laurel. Temples whispered prayers with his name. Rome, once allergic to kings, now toyed with worship. To the people it felt natural. Their lives were fuller under him. To the Senate it was suffocating. A man who shaped calendars, gave laws, pardoned enemies, and bent traditions began to look less like a leader and more like a god among mortals. Fear grew. Could a republic survive when one man stood taller than its very ideals? Caesar's foreign campaigns fed that fear. His talk of conquering Parthia was more than ambition. It was myth. Rome remembered Crassus's humiliating defeat, and Caesar promised redemption. Soldiers thrilled at the thought of glory, while citizens dreamed of endless spoils. Yet senators saw something darker. If Caesar triumphed, he would return with an aura beyond question. He would be untouchable. They feared not just his victories, but what victory would crown him. The Parthian campaign became less about empire and more about destiny, and destiny scared the old guard more than defeat. His connection with Cleopatra poured fuel on suspicion. Rome prided itself on discipline. Yet here was its greatest general entwined with the Queen of Egypt. To some, it was romance. To others, it was seduction of power. Cleopatra arrived in Rome not as a guest, but as a presence. Her very existence in Caesar's orbit unsettled traditions. Was Caesar Rome's ruler or Egypt's partner? Senators whispered of dynasties, of foreign influence creeping into Rome's veins. Cleopatra's allure was undeniable, but to Rome's elite, It was poison disguised as perfume. Caesar, however, moved as though untouchable. He walked through Rome with minimal guard, confident in his charisma and clemency. His soldiers adored him, the people cheered him, and he assumed loyalty outweighed envy. But envy lingers. Each smile hid suspicion. Each applause concealed resentment. He underestimated pride. The one currency senators valued above life. Caesar thought. Clemency softened his foes. It merely reminded them of their dependence. Gratitude, when forced, curdles into hatred. Rome's elite began to agree on one chilling thought. The Republic could not breathe under Caesar's weight. In public festivals, he staged power like theater, gladiator games, parades of spoils, feasts for the masses. All painted Caesar as generous, godlike, yet beneath the spectacle, symbols betrayed the Republic's decay. The people became spectators, not citizens. Senators became audience members to Caesar's performance. Each celebration, two glorios carried a shadow. The Republic once thrived on balance and debate, but now balance was spectacle, and debate was theater. Caesar was the playwright, and Rome performed his script. Some watched with delight, others sharpened their daggers backstage. The moment with Antony and the crown during the Lupercalia festival captured Rome's dilemma perfectly. Caesar refused to crown 3 times, and each refusal won applause, yet the gesture itself left scars. The crown had appeared. The thought of kingship had been entertained. Even refusal could not erase the image of Caesar with a diadem hovering above his head. Rome's people debated his sincerity. Was it humility or rehearsal? Caesar enjoyed the ambiguity. But ambiguity breeds unrest. The stage was set for suspicion to transform into conspiracy. Mercy, ironically, became Caesar's downfall. Rivals he pardoned returned to the Senate. Plotting in gratitude's shadow took it an enemy's final. But to forgive one is to live under their resentment. Caesar chose mercy as strategy, believing it would heal divisions. Instead, it made his enemies mask hatred with smiles. Clemency proved power but sowed paranoia. Senators realized they could never outshine him, never reclaim dignity. Survival meant ending Caesar, not confronting him, but erasing him. Forgiveness had bought time, but time was running out. Brutus's role became pivotal. To Romans, his lineage was sacred, descended from the Brutus who expelled kings centuries earlier. If anyone embodied the Republic, it was him. Caesar loved him, trusted him, perhaps even saw him as a son. Yet, that bond became a weapon. Conspirators knew that Brutus's participation would cloak murder as patriotism. Without him, they were criminals. With him, they were liberators. Brutus hesitated, torn between affection and tradition. But tradition whispered louder. In joining them, he did not just betray Caesar, he betrayed love itself. Caesar's disregard for omens showed his fatal flaw: hubris. Warnings poured in, soothsayers cautioning, dreams of blood, sacrifices gone wrong. Calpurnia begged him not to attend the Senate that day. Caesar laughed, dismissing them as superstition. Fate was not something to fear, but something to command. In his mind, no dagger could touch him. He had survived too much, won too greatly. But history has sharp timing. His belief in invincibility became his blindfold. The Ides of March was not fate's. Warning it was fate's appointment. By then, the Republic had ceased to function as it once had. Laws bent, traditions broken, and senators reduced to actors in Caesar's orbit. Yet in their hearts, pride remained. Pride, more than love of the Republic, fueled conspiracy. They could not accept mercy as chains, or power as theater. They plotted not because Caesar failed them, but because he succeeded too well. The irony is sharp. Caesar's greatness built the case for his destruction, and as daggers were sharpened, the Republic prepared to write its final act. The Senate's discontent hardened into a quiet storm. Publicly, senators bowed, applauded, and praised Caesar. Privately, they seethed, whispering in corners, exchanging glances heavy with intent. They feared not just his power but his permanence. A republic could survive many ambitious men, but not one who blurred into myth. His clemency, once praised, now mocked them. They looked like children granted mercy by a father-king. Pride stung sharper than any blade. Rome's old guard decided that the Republic's survival demanded more than speeches. It demanded action. Action in shadows. Sharp, final. Caesar, though sharp as ever, missed the full depth of their rage. He was too confident, too assured of his place as Rome's savior. He walked openly, without a guard that matched his stature, believing loyalty outweighed fear. His confidence made him vulnerable. To his friends, this was arrogance. To his enemies, opportunity. The whispers grew into meetings, into plans. Senators who once fought each other now clasped hands over a single resolve. They would strike not as rivals, but as saviors. In their minds, betrayal was not treason, it was duty. Brutus stood at the heart of their dilemma, a man of honor, loved by Caesar, yet bound by loyalty to Rome's traditions. To kill Caesar was to kill a father figure, but to spare him was to strangle the Republic. His name carried weight, a legacy tied to the founding of Rome itself. Brutus hesitated, torn by affection and obligation, yet conspirators pressed him. Only his presence could mask murder as salvation. Without Brutus, they were but killers. With Brutus, they could claim justice, reluctantly, painfully. Brutus's silence turned into consent. The Ides of March dawned like any other. The streets bustled, markets hummed, and Caesar prepared for the Senate meeting. Omens and warnings peppered his morning dreams of blood, sacrifices gone wrong. Whispers from soothsayers. Calpurnia, his wife, begged him to stay home, shaken by visions of his death. Caesar, half amused, half irritated, dismissed them as superstition. Rome, he insisted, needed him. To bend to omens was weakness, and Caesar was no weak man. He dressed, he walked, and he strode toward fate. History rarely shouts, it whispers, and Caesar did not listen. Inside the Senate chamber, the stage was set. Senators greeted him warmly, smiles disguising daggers. The marble walls echoed with false pleasantries. Caesar moved to his seat, unaware or perhaps unwilling to believe that betrayal crouched so near. Conversation flowed, but tension dripped thicker than oil. Every step he took tightened the noose. The Republic's last act had become theater, its senators now actors in a tragedy they wrote together. Caesar, the lead, did not know his lines ended here, not with applause, but with silence broken by steel. The first blade struck suddenly, chaos disguised as courage. Caesar staggered, shocked not by pain but by the sight of familiar faces wielding death. More blades followed, stabbing not just flesh, but legacy. He cried out not for mercy, but in disbelief. When Brutus raised his hand, the wound went deeper than steel could cut. Caesar's final words, whatever they were, dissolved into history's echo. What mattered was the silence that followed. A god among men lay bleeding on the Senate floor, undone not by armies, but by his own peers. Rome froze in the aftermath. Senators fled, citizens panicked, and the city seemed to exhale in horror. The conspirators shouted freedom, declaring the Republic saved, but the people did not cheer. Instead, they mourned. To them, Caesar had been hope, bread, and spectacle. His death felt less like liberation and more like robbery. The conspirators miscalculated. They thought killing a man would kill his influence. Instead, they ignited a fire. Martyrs inspire more than rulers, and in Caesar's death, the Republic gained not freedom, but chaos. Mark Antony stepped into the vacuum, grief wrapped in fury. His speech at Caesar's funeral was not just mourning, but manipulation. He held up the bloodied cloak, displayed the wounds, named the traitors. The crowd wept, then burned with anger. Antony transformed sorrow into riot, and riot into revolution. The Senate's claim of liberation collapsed in hours. Streets once filled with trade, now filled with fire. Caesar's body lay still, but a shadow marched, stronger than ever. The assassins had ended one man but unleashed a legend. Brutus, torn by guilt, struggled to justify his part. He framed the murderer's duty, not malice, but his words fell flat against Antony's passion. Romans preferred grief over philosophy, rage over reasoning. The conspirators who thought themselves heroes found themselves villains in the eyes of the mob. They fled, Rome exiled by the very people they claimed to protect. The republic they killed to save now spat them out. Brutus's name, once noble, now echoed with regret. The stain of betrayal clung too tightly to wash away. Caesar's death marked the republic's last gasp. It was not rebirth, but the beginning of Rome's final transformation. Power no longer belonged to the Senate's collective, but to those who commanded loyalty and legions. Caesar had died, but his model endured. Ruled not by balance, but by dominance, Rome's fate had shifted irreversibly. The Republic had been stabbed, just like Caesar, and though it lingered a while, its heartbeat slowed. Soon, an empire would rise from its corpse, and Caesar, even in death, would be its architect. The Ides of March began like an ordinary Roman morning, yet tension lingered like smoke. Vendors shouted in the markets, citizens bustled about, and senators prepared their speeches. But Caesar awoke to a flood of warnings. Soothsayers muttered about danger. Calpurnia had dreamt of his murder, and even loyal friends whispered unease. She begged him not to go. Caesar, however, dismissed it all as superstition. To avoid the Senate would look weak, and weakness was one thing he would never allow. With pride as his armor, he stepped into the day, blind to the trap waiting. The Senate chamber gleamed with marble grandeur, but its beauty masked poison. Senators greeted Caesar warmly, their smiles sharp as daggers hidden beneath their robes. He entered confidently, as though among colleagues, not conspirators, yet loyalty had already fled these holes. Each compliment was camouflage, each not a lie. Caesar, the master of reading men on battlefields, underestimated the silent storm in politics. He sat at his place, thinking he ruled the room, unaware the stage had been set for his final act. The first dagger tore the illusion, struck by men he called allies. Caesar staggered in shock. Pain was less piercing than betrayal. More blades followed, raining upon him, each one a statement of defiance. The chamber filled with chaos, shouts mingling with the scrape of steel. Caesar looked not upon enemies, but upon familiar faces twisted by envy. The Republic's defenders became executioners, convinced their violence was patriotism. Every stab was less about flesh and more about erasing a shadow. Then came Brutus to Caesar. He was not just another senator, but a man he trusted deeply, perhaps even as a son. When Brutus raised his dagger, the wound cut deeper than any steel could reach. Whether or not Caesar whispered E2, "Brute doesn't matter." What mattered was his eyes dimming with disbelief, his trust collapsing in silence. Betrayal is always sharp, but betrayal from love is fatal. In that moment, Caesar fell not just as a man, but as a symbol Rome had struck its own reflection. When the blades stopped, the chamber fell into stunned silence. Caesar lay lifeless at the Senate's feet, his blood staining the marble like a signature Rome could never erase. Senators pulled back, shaken by their own brutality, yet convinced they had restored freedom. They declared the Republic safe, their daggers framed as instruments of justice. But outside those walls, the people waited, and the people would not agree. What senators saw as liberation, citizens would see as robbery. The Republic had not been rescued, it had been wounded. Rome's streets buzzed with confusion as news spread. Citizens cried out in disbelief, soldiers trembled in fury, and veterans who once marched with Caesar mourned openly. The conspirators, proud of their deed, miscalculated the pulse of the people. They expected cheers, but they received grief. Caesar had given them bread, land, and glory. To the masses, his death was not freedom's victory but hope's murder. Instead of unity, the city fractured. The Senate had killed a man but unleashed a storm. Mark Antony understood the moment. At Caesar's funeral, he raised his voice, not just in grief, but in fire, displaying Caesar's wounds and blood-stained cloak. He turned sorrow into rage. The people wept, then boiled with anger. Antony's speech did what no blade could. It transformed Caesar into a martyr. Rome erupted into riots. Senators fled, and the Republic cracked. In killing Caesar, the conspirators ended their enemy, but birthed the legend that would haunt them. Caesar was more powerful dead than alive. Brutus, once noble, found himself crushed under guilt. He tried to justify the murder as love for the Republic, delivering speeches about duty and liberty, but his words were drowned by Antony's passion and the people's grief. Philosophy could not compete with wounds displayed on marble steps. Romans chose heart over reason, loyalty over pride. Brutus and his allies, who thought themselves saviors, were branded traitors. Their noble cause crumbled into exile, their names stained by betrayal. History would remember not their intentions, but their daggers. Civil war followed like thunder after lightning. Antony, Octavian, and Lepidus rose to fill the void, each carrying pieces of Caesar's legacy. Rome descended once again into bloodshed, not because Caesar lived, but because he died. The conspirators thought they saved the Republic, but they doomed it. The balance of power was shattered. From then on, Rome would not be ruled by tradition, but by whoever commanded the legions. Caesar's death was not the Republic's salvation, but its funeral march. In the end, the Ides of March became more than a date. It became a symbol, etched into history. A day when Rome murdered its brightest star only to realize his shadow stretched farther than life itself. The Senate had hoped to restore balance, but they created a vacuum that birthed an empire. Caesar, the man who played God, achieved immortality not through crowns or victories, but through martyrdom. His death transformed Rome forever, proving that sometimes killing a man does not end. His reignette begins at Octavian was only 19 when fate hurled him onto Rome's main stage. Caesar's will named him adopted son and heir, a shock to both the Senate and the people. No one expected the quiet youth, barely seasoned by war, to shoulder the weight of Caesar's legacy. Yet Octavian moved with cunning beyond his years. It was said Caesar'd name like a weapon, gathering loyalty from veterans and sympathy from citizens. Rome, grieving Caesar, found solace in his heir. Where the Senate saw a boy, the people began to see a beacon. Mark Antony, however, considered himself Caesar's true successor, older, battle-hardened, and charismatic. Antony had the soldiers and experience, but Octavian had something sharper. Patience. He studied Antony's flaws, his indulgence, his temper, his flair for spectacle, and slowly positioned himself as the steadier choice. Their uneasy alliance, meant to avenge Caesar, masked a deeper rivalry. Both knew Rome could not hold them together forever. For now, unity served purpose, but ambition simmered beneath every handshake. Rome was too small for two heirs of Caesar. Together with Lepidus, they formed the Second Triumvirate, a pact of power carved in blood. Their first act was brutal. Purges across Rome. Lists of enemies were drawn, and names condemned. Senators and equestrians who once cheered Caesar now fell to the blades of his avengers. Cicero, Rome's famed orator, met his end in these purges. Silenced for his sharp tongue against Antony, the city learned quickly. Rome was no longer governed by debate, but by decree. The triumvirate did not argue with enemies. They erased them. Antony pursued Caesar's killers across the east, clashing with Brutus and Cassius. At Philippi, the Republic's so-called saviors met their doom. Brutus fell on his own sword, his noble ideals buried in dust. Cassius followed, despairing of defeat. With their deaths, the dream of reviving the Republic collapsed. Antony and Octavian declared victory not just for themselves, but for Caesar's ghost. Rome no longer belonged to tradition. It belonged to power. Caesar's assassins had struck to save liberty, but instead guaranteed its burial. Rome, however, was never a city of unity. For long, the alliance fractured under ambition. Lepidus, weak and ambitious, overstepped and was swiftly sidelined. That left Antony and Octavian staring across a shrinking stage. Antony's bond with Cleopatra gave him glamour, but also suspicion. To Romans, his partnership with Egypt's queen reeked of betrayal. Was Antony Rome's general or Cleopatra's consort? Octavian exploited the image mercilessly, framing Antony as seduced by foreign influence. What was love in Alexandria became treason in Rome's streets. Octavian's propaganda was brilliant. He painted himself as the guardian of Rome's traditions, the defender of Italian values. Antony became the villain, a man who abandoned Rome for Egyptian luxury. Pamphlets, speeches, and whispers spread like wildfire. Roman saw Cleopatra not as a queen, but as a threat, a foreign shadow looming over the Tiber. Every scandal, every rumor, Octavian turned into a weapon. Antony had armies, but Octavian controlled perception, and in politics, perception often matters more than swords. The rivalry climaxed at Actium. On the sea, Antony and Cleopatra faced Octavian's fleet. It was not just a battle of ships, but of narratives. Octavian framed it as Rome versus decadence, discipline versus corruption. The clash ended with Antony's forces broken, Cleopatra fleeing, and Octavian victorious. The sea swallowed Antony's ambitions, leaving Octavian master of Rome. The boy Caesar adopted had outplayed warriors older and stronger, proving himself not just heir but ruler. Rome had its answer. The Republic was over. An empire loomed. Antony and Cleopatra's tragic end sealed the story. Cornered, defeated, they chose death over capture. To Rome, it was the fall of traitors. To history, it was romance wrapped in ruin. Their love, once painted as dangerous, became legend. But for Octavian, it was opportunity. Vitam gone, no rival remained. He returned to Rome a savior, claiming he had preserved the Republic. In truth, he had buried it. The Senate, too weary to resist, gave him titles, honors, and powers no man had held before. Octavian became Augustus, the first emperor. Rome, exhausted by generations of war, accepted his reign as peace. The Republic lived on in name, but its spirit had vanished. Augustus ruled with subtlety, cloaking monarchy in the language of tradition. He was princeps, first citizen, not king, but everyone knew the truth. One man now ruled what once was shared. Caesar's blood, spilled on the Senate floor, had paved the road for empire. Augustus was the destination. In Augustus's rise, Caesar's ghost lingered. The assassins who tried to save the Republic ensured its end. The Senate, once supreme, became decoration. The people, who cheered for bread and games, welcomed stability over freedom. Caesar's gamble, his refusal to bow, had changed Rome forever. He died, believing himself betrayed. Yet in death, he became immortal not as a god, but as the architect of empire. His heirs carried his shadow, and Rome marched not into freedom, but into centuries of imperial rule. Augustus understood power in ways Caesar never fully did. Where Caesar moved boldly, Augustus moved carefully. He cloaked absolute control in the language of tradition. He restored temples, revived ceremonies, and gave senators a stage to act important, even as their influence faded. Rome believed it was living under the Republic still, but in truth, it was under monarchy, disguised as modesty. Augustus ruled not with daggers or a spectacle, but with patience, letting the people grow used to his quiet dominance. Bread and circuses became the cornerstone of his rule. Grain shipments fed the bellies of the poor, while grand games distracted their minds. The Colosseum was yet to come, but spectacles and arenas became a rhythm of life. Citizens who once rioted now applauded. The Republic had asked them to think like citizens. Augustus asked them only to live like spectators. In exchange, he gave them stability, safety, and peace. It was a deal they accepted gladly, proving that comfort often outweighs freedom. His reforms touched every corner of Rome. Tax systems streamlined, provinces reorganized, roads repaired, and armies professionalized. The empire stretched further, but its core grew stronger. Augustus understood that Rome's survival rested not only on conquest, but on administration. He turned generals into governors, soldiers into settlers, and chaos into order. His genius was not just in fighting wars, but in preventing them. Rome became less a city of conflict and more an engine of empire, humming with efficiency designed to last centuries. Religion became another pillar of control. Augustus styled himself as chosen by the gods, yet humble before them. He encouraged the worship of Caesar as divine, making himself the son of a god. This blurred the line between politics and faith. To disobey Augustus was not just rebellion against the state, but sacrilege against the divine. Romans, already steeped in tradition, accepted the shift in elevating his adoptive father to godhood. Augustus placed himself above ordinary men without ever wearing a crown. The Pax Romana, Rome's golden peace, was born. For over 2 centuries, the empire enjoyed stability unparalleled in its past. Roads stretched across continents, cities flourished, and trade networks connected cultures once divided. To Romans, it felt like the gods themselves had blessed Augustus, yet beneath the peace lay blood. The wars of conquest, the silencing of dissent, the purges all paved the way for stability. Pax Romana was not free, it was purchased. The cost was liberty, but the reward was order. For most, it was a bargain worth taking. Still, cracks whispered at the edges. Senators resented their loss of power, though too fearful to resist. Soldiers, loyal to paying commanders, became instruments of ambition. Provinces accepted Roman rule, but rebellions flickered like sparks. Augustus's brilliance kept it contained, but the pattern was clear. Rome's peace rested on one man's shoulders. Without him, the balance could falter. The Republic was gone, but the empire was fragile, its glittering stability masking deeper risks. Augustus's personal life fueled both admiration and gossip. His careful marriages tied him to allies, but his family drama created tension. His stepson Tiberius would inherit power, though reluctantly. Succession remained Rome's weakest link. The Republic once prided itself on rotating power. Now the empire depended on bloodlines and adoption. Augustus could design systems, but he could not control mortality. Every choice of heir carried risks, and the empire's stability was only as strong as its next ruler. Cleopatra's ghost lingered. 2. Antony's fall left Rome dominant, but his romance with Egypt's queen became legend. Augustus used her as propaganda to justify his wars, but history remembered her as more than scandal. Cleopatra symbolized the blend of love, politics, and ambition that shaped Rome's path. In defeating Antony and Cleopatra, Augustus defeated rivals, but he also inherited their story. Rome's empire carried Egypt's allure in its veins. Even as Augustus claimed sole victory, monuments rose to secure his memory. The Ara Pacis celebrated peace, marble telling the story of stability Augustus brought. His mausoleum stood as a declaration of legacy. Every stone in Rome echoed his presence. Every road carried his imprint. Augustus understood what Caesar began. Power was not just about ruling, but about branding. By engraving his story into the city itself, Augustus ensured future generations would see him not as a man, but as Rome's eternal architect. When Augustus finally died, Rome did not collapse, it transitioned. The empire he built was too entrenched to vanish overnight. Tiberius inherited, reluctantly, and the machinery of empire ground on. The Republic was a memory, a ghost in the marble. Augustus had completed Caesar's work, not with thunder, but with patience. The boy who had outmaneuvered Antony ended as the man who reshaped Rome forever. The age of emperors had dawned, and the world would never return to what it was before. Tiberius never wanted the throne, but Augustus left him little choice. The new emperor was capable, but bitter, suspicious of those around him. Rome, used to Augustus's careful charm, now faced a ruler who distrusted senators and despised public life. He withdrew often, letting his subordinates govern, and paranoia began to seep into the empire. The system Augustus built held firm, but cracks widened. Tiberius showed that emperors were human, and when flawed, the empire felt it. Rome under Tiberius was stable but uneasy. He kept the armies loyal and borders secure. Yet his reign lacked the warmth of Augustus. Trials for treason multiplied. Senators feared speaking freely, and whispers of conspiracy haunted the court. To the people bred, and games continued. But behind marble walls, the empire turned colder. The idea of one man holding such power now felt both secure and dangerous. Rome's fate swung with the character of its emperors. The shadow of Caesar still lingered. Every emperor measured himself against the man who toppled the Republic, and Augustus, who built an empire. Caesar had won with charisma and daring. Augustus with patience and reform. Tiberius, however, ruled with caution and fear. His reign reminded Romans that their system relied not on institutions, but on personalities. Strong leaders could keep it afloat. Weak or cool ones could drag it down. The gamble of empire was always who came next. Beyond Rome, the empire stretched wider. Roads carried soldiers and merchants alike, binding cultures under a single banner. Yet, the further Rome expanded, the harder it became to control. Revolts simmered in provinces, and foreign threats tested the legions. Augustus had crafted an empire strong enough to endure, but it demanded constant vigilance. Tiberius managed, though often reluctantly. His legacy became less about triumph and more about survival. In the shadows of succession, whispers grew. The empire had no clear law for choosing the next ruler: adoption, bloodline, or military. Power each played its role. The Senate's voice was gone. The people had little say. The throne belonged to whoever could claim it and keep it. That uncertainty guaranteed drama for centuries. What Augustus solved with patience, Rome would wrestle with endlessly. How do you replace a man who built eternity? Tiberius eventually retreated to the island of Capri, ruling from afar. Rumors painted him as a recluse, indulging in excess. Though history often exaggerates, still, his absence left Rome vulnerable to corrupt officials. The empire survived, but its image darkened. Augustus had seemed divine. Tiberius seemed human. Too human. The glamour of empire began to fade, revealing the cost of power when wielded without charm or vision. Through it all, Caesar's name remained a beacon. Emperors carried the title Caesar not just as a name, but as a symbol of legitimacy. To be Caesar was to embody Rome itself. Whether noble or cruel, the man who once crossed the Rubicon now lived on in every ruler's title, every inscription carved in stone. Caesar had been mortal, but his shadow stretched immortal, shaping centuries of politics, ambition, and fear. The people, for their part, adapted. They no longer expected to guide Rome's fate. Instead, they measured emperors by stability and generosity. Bread, games, safety, that was the bargain. Liberty was gone, but life was secure. Caesar had gambled with the people's trust. Augustus perfected the exchange, and Tiberius revealed its fragility. Rome had traded politics for spectacle, freedom for order, and once the deal was struck, there was no going back. Each generation of Romans looked back to Caesar differently. Some saw him as a hero who dared to challenge a broken republic. Others saw him as the man who destroyed freedom. Two emperors, he was both warning and inspiration. His life proved ambition could shatter systems. His death proved power could live beyond the grave. The contradictions of Caesar's legacy gave Rome its rhythm. Admiration mixed with fear, loyalty mixed with suspicion. By the time Tiberius died, Rome had survived another test. The empire endured, not because it was flawless, but because it was adaptable. The system Caesar cracked and Augustus rebuilt now belonged to history's current ruler, whoever that was. Caesar's gamble had become Rome's reality. The Republic was a memory. The empire was the world. And every heartbeat of that empire echoed the man who once dared to play God. Caligula arrived like sunrise after a long winter. He was Germanicus's, son Rome's, beloved golden boy, and that lineage alone felt like a blessing. In his first months, he did everything a weary empire wanted. Ended treason trials, recalled exiles, staged joyful games, remitted certain taxes, and honored the memory of his family. Senators breathed easier. Crowds chanted his name. Soldiers pocketed bonuses and grinned. After Tiberius's distant, suspicious rule, Caligula's warmth felt like oxygen. He walked the forum with easy charm, waved two children, and promised a Rome that would laugh again. Hope, so often rationed, suddenly flowed. Even the Senate, trained to frown, smiled for a while. It seemed possible that the title Caesar could be both gentle and glorious authority without paranoia, splendor without fear. Rome let itself believe. Then illness struck, a fierce, bewildering collapse that kept him bedridden, and the city on edge. When he rose, the tone had shifted. Whether the fever scarred his mind or merely stripped away restraint, the princeps who returned seemed larger, louder. Generosity swelled into celebration became compulsion. He multiplied festivals, demanded spectacles, and spent as if the treasury were a story with unlimited pages. The people still cheered. But some cheers trembled, counsel felt dangerous. Caution felt disloyal. He laughed at applause the way sailors love wind indiscriminately. The court learned to read his face, like weather, guessing when storms might break. Rome, still grateful, began to glance over its shoulder. His relationship with the Senate curdled from courtesy into contest. Caligula enjoyed humiliating men who had perfected dignity as a profession. He mocked long speeches with short jokes, turned debates into performances, and measured status not by tradition, but by proximity to himself. Honors that once felt rare suddenly fell like confetti statues. Senators, outwardly adoring, inwardly stewed. The more they clapped, the smaller they felt. The smaller they felt, the more they whispered. Rumors traveled faster than edicts. Tales of eccentricities, multiplied, some true, some sharpened by spite. Caligula treated Rome's institutions as props, and props, however polished, cannot love you back. The Senate learned fear. The emperor learned contempt. Divinity crept from metaphor into policy. Caligula didn't just accept comparisons to gods. Staged. Staged. Costumes echoed Olympus. Altars acquired a new name. Processions blurred theater and theology. For common crowds, the pageantry dazzled, a moving mural of power and myth. For traditionists, it was blasphemy and brocade. The line between honoring a ruler and worshipping him had always been thin in empires. Caligula danced on it. He wanted the visible proof of invisible art, temples, inscriptions, incense. That spelled his importance in fragrant air. In a city that once expelled kings, this performance tasted dangerous, yet the applause was real, and it fed him. The more he played a god, the more he demanded a god's obedience. Money began to matter in the unglamorous way almost shortages can teach. The early gifts, the vast spectacles, and the palace's appetite emptied coffers with theatrical speed. New taxes appeared with inventive names. Old exemptions vanished quietly. Auctions filled the forum with imperial odds and ends. Officials learned to convert proximity into profit. Still, even excess built things. Seeds of aqueducts and harbor works. Fresh stone in places that needed glue. The city gleamed while ledgers ached. Tutimasis marble is proof. Tutrisures. It is arithmetic. Caligula wrote beauty in public and dead in margins, trusting that tomorrow would applaud as loudly as today. Rome, too, enchanted to count, kept clapping. His flirtations with war became spectacles of their own. The famous story of seashell troops mustered at the channel. Tenor Doratho collect the spoils of the sea. Maybe parody sharpened by enemies, but it stuck because it felt like him. Theater first, strategy second. Another legend told of a floating bridge built only so he could gallop across the bay and defy a profecia gesture less about distance than about destiny. Whether perfectly true or perfectly embroidered, these scenes captured his rules logic. Make the unimaginable visible, turn whispers into parades, and let all silenced out. Armies, however, prefer purpose to pageantry. Soldiers grinned. Tengrumbot inside the palace. Light softened while shadows lengthened. Courtiers perfected the art of surviving moods. Jesters learned when not to jest. Trials returned in new clothing. Exile wore fresh addresses, and quiet men discovered how loud silence can be. Caligula's circle shrank as suspicion grew. He tested loyalty the way storms test roofs suddenly. And at night, some bent, some broke. Yet crowds outside still thrilled to chariot races and booming horns. The city lived in two tempos. Public joy and private dread. Empires can endure that dissonance for a time, because bread and music suit, but fear collects interest. The contradictions sharpened him into symbol. To the plebs, he remained a giver of games, the fountain of surprise, an emperor who made boredom illegal. To merchants, he was both spender and taxman. To poets, he was material. To senators, He was humiliation with a pulse. Every group saw a different mirror, and each reflection argued with the next. That is the hazard of divine branding. Once a ruler becomes everyone's myth, he is no one's partner. Caligula wanted Rome to orbit him. Rome wanted gravity without eclipse. The tension tightened. String by shining string. Conspiracy blooms where fear waters it. The Praetorian Guard, guardians bred to obey, found themselves treated as stagehands in someone else's drama. Officers measured risk, counted friends, and discovered arithmetic that ended in steel. In a palace corridor, neither battlefield nor senate. Floor the play ended. No gore sung. No triumph sounded. Only the blunt announcement that even a god is mortal when loyalty evaporates. Caligula fell not to foreign spears, but to domestic math. The audience, long captive, gasped. Some in sorrow, some in relief, all in awe of how quickly thunder can stop. Chaos auditioned for the throne. Senators tried to improvise a republic revival, waving legality like a banner history had already folded. The Praetorians, practical as paymasters, found Claudius trembling behind a curtain and crowned him on the spot, proof that in Rome, accident can become dynasty if soldiers agree. The lesson felt carved in fresh marble. The name Caesar had outgrown any single life. Caligula's blaze revealed the system's wires. His fall revealed its circuits, and Rome, stunned but practiced, resumed its pageant. New actor. Same stage. The empire's heartbeat steadying under a different hand. Claudius's sudden rise felt almost like comedies. Bookish, stammering uncle pulled from behind a curtain to become emperor. Yet Rome had seen enough drama to accept irony as destiny. Claudius lacked charisma but overflowed with caution, and that was precisely what a shaken empire craved. He secured the loyalty of the guard with gold, soothed the Senate with courtesy, and reassured the people with games. Unlike Caligula's volcanic theatrics, Claudius moved like water, quiet, adaptable, persistent. He restored a sense of normal rhythm, making bureaucracy his weapon and scholarship his armor. Rome discovered that survival sometimes wears spectacles rather than crowns. He proved far more capable than anyone expected. Claudius reformed the administration, strengthened provincial governance, and expanded citizenship. His passion for detail, mocked as pedantry, turned into policy efficiency. He trusted freedmen and secretaries more than nobles, which angered elites but professionalized the machinery of empire. Under his watch, aqueducts lengthened, granaries filled, and law gained new ink. Rome, long used to emperors who roared, now had one who read footnotes and signed them into law. To some, it felt unglamorous. To others, it felt like breathing again. Stability may lack applause, but it lengthens empires. Conquest, however, remained Rome's favorite song, and Claudius gave them a new chorus. Britannia, the invasion of the island long considered remote, stubborn, and Fogdrapi delighted Romans. With the promise of fresh triumph, legions marched across rivers, engineers built bridges, and imperial scribes inked victory lines. Though resistance was fierce, the eventual foothold shone as proof that even an unlikely emperor could etch his name in stone. Triumph in Rome was staged with elephants, prisoners, and the emperor himself riding tall. Britannia became less a place than a theater backdrop for Claudius's credibility. The Senate, though begrudging, had to clap domestically. Claudius cultivated pragmatism over glamour. He introduced policies to integrate provinces, ensuring that Rome felt less like a parasite and more like a manager. New citizens, new trade routes, and new laws tied distant regions tighter to the center. For common people, this meant smoother grain supply and less famine panic. For merchants, it meant contracts. For elites, it meant less autonomy. His reign wasn't free of intribalist plots, poisoned whispers, and ambitious wives-spot. It demonstrated that the empire could function with a ruler who valued governance as much as grandeur. Rome had survived lightning. Now it endured under lamplight. Intrigue, though, never leaves Rome hungry. Messalina, Claudius's young wife, became infamous for scandal and ambition. Her plots, alliances, and betrayals turned the palace into whispered theater. When her downfall came swift, brutal, inevitably, reminded everyone that even quiet reigns echo with daggers. Claudius, manipulated and embarrassed, executed her but bore the scars of trust misplaced. This vulnerability hardened him, yet also isolated him. He remarried, this time to Agrippina the Younger, whose ambition was as sharp as her pedigree. She brought a son Nero into the palace, planting seeds that would soon sprout into tangled branches of fate. Agrippina understood Rome's theater of power better than most men. She maneuvered her son Nero into adoption, ensuring his place as heir above Claudius's own child Britannicus. Wheat whispers, bribes, and calculated smiles. She wove her web across senate halls and palace corridors. Claudius, whether weary or blinded by affection, allowed the arrangements. Rome watched with fascination as a woman played politics at imperial scale and audacity rare. Even in that ruthless city, to some, Agrippina was a guardian of dynasty. To others, a storm in silk. Either way, she shifted the empire's course with every glance. The end of Claudius's reign carried the scent of poison, though history debates who poured the cup. Ancient writers, fond of drama, point to Agrippina. Eager to secure Nero's succession, with a true or embroidered, the story fit Rome's taste for irony. The Scholar Emperor, undone not by swords but by supper. His death marked another turn in the saga of Caesars, a reminder that power, however gently worn, remained precarious. Stability, once again, gave way to uncertainty. The name Caesar still glittered, but the ground beneath it shook like distant thunder. Rome braced itself for the next act, and so Nero stepped onto the stage, young, charming, and already legendary in promise. To the people was a fresh start, to the elites, a gamble. To Agrippina, her masterpiece, Rome greeted him with cautious hope, the same refrain it had sung for Augustus, Tiberius, Caligula, and Claudius. Each time the melody changed, but the chorus remained. Maybe this one will last. Nero smiled, sang, and promised light. No one could know yet that his fire would burn both literally and metaphorically, branding Rome with one of its most infamous chapters. The story of the Caesars, once again, sharpened its quill.